Imagine the religious world of Jesus as a pyramid. Not a perfect ranking of who was stronger, richer, or more important. Think of it instead as a map. A map of the teachers, priests, legal experts, political supporters, social outsiders, and rival communities that shaped life in first-century Judea. Some of these groups controlled sacred institutions. Others interpreted the law of Moses. Some worked closely with political rulers. Others were rejected by the religious establishment entirely. They disagreed about resurrection, ritual purity, taxation, Roman occupation, the temple, and even the correct place to worship God. And then Jesus entered the middle of this complicated world. He taught in their synagogues. He entered their temple. He debated their scholars. He ate with the people they rejected. He confronted those who used religion for status. But he also invited political collaborators, revolutionaries, and outsiders to sit at the same table. To understand why the message of Jesus created so much tension, we need to examine this world one group at a time. And we begin at the top of our map, with the Sadducees. The Sadducees. The Sadducees were closely connected to the wealthy priestly establishment in Jerusalem. Their influence came from the temple, the most important religious institution in Jewish life. The temple was not simply a building where people prayed. It was the spiritual center of the nation. Pilgrims traveled there from distant regions to worship, present offerings, and participate in the great religious festivals. Sacrifices were performed there. Animals were inspected. Money was exchanged. Offerings were collected. Priests, workers, guards, and administrators all operated within the temple system. That meant the temple was not only a sacred place, it was also an economic center, a political symbol, and a source of enormous institutional influence. The Sadducees were associated with the aristocratic families surrounding that institution. Unlike the Pharisees, they rejected beliefs such as the resurrection of the dead. Their theology was generally more conservative, in the sense that they placed less authority on later traditions developed outside the written Torah. But theology was only part of their position. The temple existed under Roman occupation. Its leaders had to preserve Jewish worship while avoiding public unrest that might provoke violent intervention from the empire. This placed the Sadducees in a difficult and influential position. They became guardians of a fragile arrangement between religious authority, economic interests, local leadership, and Roman political control. From their perspective, stability was essential. If a preacher attracted large crowds, spoke about a coming kingdom, or created disorder during a religious festival, Rome might respond with force. That helps explain why Jesus became so threatening to the temple establishment. When Jesus entered the temple courts and overturned the tables of the money changers, he did more than interrupt a commercial transaction. He challenged the relationship between worship, money, authority, and control. His actions struck directly at the institution from which the Sadducees received their influence. To many ordinary people, Jesus appeared to be cleansing a sacred place. To those responsible for maintaining order, he looked like a dangerous disruption. The Sadducees remind us that religious institutions can become closely tied to the systems that protect them. And when the survival of the institution becomes the highest goal, truth itself can begin to look like a threat. But while the Sadducees were centered around the temple in Jerusalem, another group exercised influence much closer to everyday life: the Pharisees. The Pharisees were teachers and interpreters of the law. Their influence was not limited to the temple. It reached into local synagogues, villages, homes, meals, and ordinary routines. They believed that holiness should not belong only to priests serving in Jerusalem. The ordinary person could also live a life devoted to God. Prayer, fasting, giving, food, clothing, work, rest, and family life could all become expressions of faithfulness. In one sense, this was a powerful idea. It brought religious devotion into everyday life. But it also created a danger. When holiness becomes a visible system of behavior, people can begin measuring themselves against one another. Who fasts more? Who gives more? who follows every ritual correctly, who appears disciplined, who is pure, and who is not. The Gospels repeatedly showed Jesus confronting Pharisees who had allowed outward performance to replace inner transformation. He criticized public displays of prayer made for attention. He criticized exaggerated expressions of fasting. He criticized the habit of focusing on small religious details while neglecting justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The problem was not prayer. The problem was praying to be admired. The problem was not fasting. The problem was turning fasting into evidence of moral superiority. The problem was not obedience. The problem was transforming obedience into a ladder of status. In modern language, some of these religious leaders behaved like moral influencers. Their authority depended on appearing more disciplined, more informed, and more righteous than everyone else. Every action became part of a public identity. Every failure had to be hidden, and every rule could become another way to divide the worthy from the unworthy. Jesus challenged that entire performance. He described religious leaders who cleaned the outside of the cup, while the inside remained full of greed and self-interest. He condemned those who placed heavy burdens on other people, while refusing to help carry those burdens themselves. But the Pharisees were not all identical. Some listened to Jesus. Some invited him into their homes. Some defended fair legal procedures. And the early Christian movement itself included people with Pharisaic backgrounds. The deeper conflict was not simply Jesus against every Pharisee. It was a conflict over the meaning of faithfulness. Was holiness primarily about visible separation and religious reputation? Or was it revealed through humility, mercy, justice, and love? The Sadducees guarded the temple. The Pharisees shaped religious life in the synagogues and communities. But another organized body carried out the actual rituals and daily services of the temple. The high priests, priests, and Levites. At the center of temple worship stood the high priest. Beneath him were the ordinary priests and the Levites. These groups were connected, but they did not all possess the same authority or social position. The high priest occupied one of the most influential religious offices in Judea. He represented the people during the most sacred rituals, especially on the Day of Atonement. But by the time of Jesus, the office had also become deeply political. Roman authorities and their local representatives influenced who held the position. High priests could be appointed or removed. Powerful families could remain influential even after one member no longer officially held the title. This helps explain the relationship between Annas and Caiaphas. Caiaphas held the office during much of the period associated with the ministry of Jesus. Annas, his father-in-law and a former high priest, continued to exercise considerable influence. The position was religious, but it operated within a political system controlled by Rome. Ordinary priests served in the temple according to assigned divisions and schedules. They performed sacrifices, received offerings, maintained ritual procedures, and served the worshiping population. Many ordinary priests did not possess the wealth or political influence of the high priestly families. The Levites assisted with music, organization, security, maintenance, and other practical duties. Together, these people made the daily life of the temple possible. To the public, they represented sacred service. They were the people expected to recognize what God required. That expectation makes the parable of the Good Samaritan so disturbing. In the story, a man travels from Jerusalem toward Jericho. He is attacked, robbed, beaten, and left half dead beside the road. A priest sees him, but the priest passes by. Then a Levite arrives. He also sees the wounded man, and he also passes by. Jesus never tells us exactly why. Perhaps they feared that the attackers were still nearby. Perhaps they worried about ritual impurity. Perhaps they believed someone else would help. Perhaps they were simply unwilling to accept the interruption. Whatever their reasons, their religious position did not move them toward the suffering person. Their titles identified them as servants of God. Their actions left a dying man alone in the dirt. The point is not that every priest or Levite lacked compassion. The point is that religious office does not automatically produce mercy. A person can serve a sacred institution while avoiding the wounded human being directly in front of them. Someone can become so busy protecting rituals, schedules, responsibilities, and reputation that suffering begins to look like an inconvenience. The priest and Levite understood the structure of worship, but in that moment, they failed to recognize worship when it appeared in the form of a broken person. The priests performed the rituals, but someone still had to preserve, interpret, and explain the laws behind those rituals. That responsibility belonged largely to the scribes. The scribes were trained specialists in sacred texts and religious law. They preserved writings, copied documents, studied commandments, interpreted difficult passages, and explained how ancient laws should be applied to everyday situations. They were not necessarily a separate religious sect. A scribe could be associated with the Pharisees, the priesthood, or another part of the religious system. Their power came from knowledge. Most people in the ancient world did not have personal access to large collections of written texts. Scrolls were expensive. Advanced education required time and resources. A trained expert who could read, interpret, and apply the law therefore occupied an important position. The questions they addressed were not merely academic. Where did work end and Sabbath breaking begin? What made food clean or unclean? What made a vow binding? What should happen when a commandment was violated? Who was permitted to enter certain spaces? How could someone return to religious purity? The answers could influence a person's reputation, relationships, access to the community, and understanding of their position before God. That gave the scribes enormous interpretive influence. But expertise can become a gate. Jesus accused certain legal experts of using their knowledge to create burdens that ordinary people could barely carry. They knew how to debate the meaning of a commandment, but they could fail to understand the purpose behind it. They could defend the letter of the law while neglecting the people the law was meant to protect. They could possess information about God while remaining untouched by compassion. This is one of the most universal warnings in the story. Knowledge is valuable. Education is valuable. Theology is valuable. But intelligence without mercy can turn truth into a weapon. A person can know every argument and still fail to understand the heart of what they are defending. The scribes had authority because they interpreted the sacred texts. But religious interpretation was only one part of life in Judea. Beyond the debates over Scripture stood another question. How should Jewish society live under rulers supported by Rome? That brings us to the Herodians. The Herodians were supporters of the political order connected to the dynasty of Herod. They were not primarily a school of religious interpretation. They were associated with the political world. Herod the Great and his successors ruled with Roman approval. They built palaces, cities, fortresses, ports, and large public projects. They presented themselves as defenders of stability and regional prosperity. But their authority existed because Rome allowed it to exist. Supporting the Herodian dynasty therefore meant accepting a political arrangement built on cooperation with imperial power. For people close to that system, the arrangement could provide security, land, contracts, access, and influence. For many ordinary people, however, it represented heavy taxation, political compromise, and submission to foreign domination. The Herodians believed that maintaining the established order was preferable to provoking Rome. They did not need to love the empire. They only needed to believe that resistance would create something worse. In modern terms, they functioned like defenders of the political establishment. Their interests could bring them close to other influential groups, including members of the priestly aristocracy. But political power can create unexpected alliances. The Gospels describe moments in which the Herodians cooperated with Pharisees against Jesus. These groups did not naturally agree on everything, but they could temporarily unite when they believed a common threat had appeared. One of their attempts to trap Jesus involved taxation. They asked whether it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. The question was dangerous. If Jesus openly rejected the tax, he could be accused of rebellion against Rome. If he supported it without qualification, he could lose credibility among people who hated Roman occupation. Jesus responded by asking for a coin. Whose image was on it? Caesar's. Then he gave the famous answer: "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." The Herodians represented support for the political order at the level of influence and leadership. But another group served that order much closer to the streets, where Roman demands became money taken from ordinary people. The tax collectors. Tax collectors were local people who worked within the Roman system of taxation. In older English translations, they are often called publicans. They were among the most hated people in Jewish society. To many of their neighbors, a tax collector was not simply a government employee. He was a collaborator. He took money from his own people and delivered it to the empire occupying their land. The system also created opportunities for abuse. A collector could demand more than the required amount and keep part of the difference as personal profit. This made some tax collectors wealthy. But their wealth did not bring social respect. They could possess money without belonging. They could have influence without honor. They were treated as traitors, corrupt men, and obvious sinners. Then Jesus approached a tax collector named Matthew. Matthew was sitting at the tax booth, surrounded by the machinery of Roman revenue. Jesus looked at him and said, "Follow me." There was no long public examination, no period in which Matthew first had to repair his reputation. Jesus called him while he was still sitting at the table that represented everything his community hated. Matthew stood up and followed him. Jesus later ate in his house with other tax collectors and social outsiders. In that culture, sharing a meal was not a casual gesture. It communicated welcome, relationship, and recognition. To the religious critics of Jesus, this was scandalous. Why would a teacher concerned with holiness sit at the same table as people like that? Jesus answered that healthy people do not need a physician. The sick do. His mission was not to reward people who appeared spiritually successful. It was to restore people who recognized their need for healing. Another tax collector, Zacchaeus, also appears in the gospel story. He was wealthy and deeply unpopular. But after encountering Jesus, he promised to give generously to the poor and repay those he had defrauded. The transformation was not merely emotional. It reached his money. It reached the economic damage he had caused. Jesus welcomed tax collectors, but he did not bless exploitation. Grace invited them to the table, and then called them into a different life. Tax collectors were rejected because of their cooperation with Rome. But another community faced a hostility shaped by centuries of religious, ethnic, and historical conflict. The Samaritans. The Samaritans were a distinct Israelite community centered in the region of Samaria. They shared important traditions with the Jews of Judea, including devotion to the Torah. But they disagreed about sacred history and the correct place of worship. Judeans centered worship in Jerusalem. Samaritans worshipped on Mount Gerizim. Each community questioned the religious legitimacy of the other. The conflict was not a small theological disagreement. It involved ancestry, geography, political history, sacred texts, destroyed sanctuaries, and generations of mutual suspicion. Contempt had become part of identity. Some Jews avoided traveling through Samaritan territory. To call someone a Samaritan could even function as an insult. That is why Jesus' interactions with Samaritans were so provocative. In one account, he spoke publicly with a Samaritan woman beside a well. The conversation crossed several boundaries at once. She was a woman speaking privately with a male religious teacher. She was a Samaritan speaking with a Jew, and her personal history made her vulnerable to social judgment. Yet Jesus spoke to her about worship, truth, and living water. He did not treat her as a theological problem to be defeated. He treated her as a person capable of understanding spiritual truth. But the most famous Samaritan in the teaching of Jesus appears in a story. A man is beaten and abandoned beside the road. A priest passes by. A Levite passes by. Then a Samaritan arrives. To many listeners, the Samaritan would have been the last person expected to become the hero. But he sees the wounded man and is moved with compassion. He approaches him. He treats his wounds. He places him on his own animal. He brings him to an inn. He pays for his care. And he promises to cover any additional expense. The Samaritan does what the respected religious figures fail to do. He crosses the boundary. He helps someone who may have regarded him as an enemy. He receives no public reward. He cannot know whether the wounded man will ever repay him. His compassion is costly, practical, and immediate. Jesus did not choose a priest, a scholar, or admired moral leader as the example of neighborly love. He chose the outsider. The person considered religiously wrong understood mercy better than the people considered religiously respectable. The message was devastating. Correct group identity did not automatically produce righteous action. Religious reputation did not guarantee compassion. And the person rejected by the system might understand the heart of God more clearly than those standing at its center. At this point, we have reached the bottom of our visual map. But the pyramid does not contain everyone. Some groups separated themselves from the religious establishment entirely. Others believed the whole political order needed to be overthrown. The Essenes. The Essenes responded to corruption through separation. They believed the religious establishment in Jerusalem had become deeply compromised. Many scholars associate at least part of the Essene movement with communities in the Judean wilderness, including the settlement near Qumran by the Dead Sea. Their solution was not political cooperation. It was not participation in the temple system. And it was not immediate armed revolt. It was withdrawal. They formed disciplined communities. They practiced ritual purification. They studied sacred writings. They organized communal life around strict rules. And they waited for God to intervene decisively in history. Their commitment was serious. They were willing to abandon comfort, status, and normal social life in pursuit of purity. But separation creates its own danger. A community can become so focused on protecting itself from corruption that it loses contact with the people outside it. Jesus also spent time in the wilderness, but he did not remain there. He returned to villages. He entered homes. He ate with people considered sinful. He touched the sick. He allowed the unclean to approach him. His holiness did not depend on permanent distance from broken people. It moved toward them. The Essene instinct was to preserve purity by leaving the corrupted world behind. Another response to Roman occupation moved in the opposite direction. Instead of escaping the system, some wanted to destroy it. The Zealots and the Sicari. Anti-Roman resistance existed in different forms during and after the lifetime of Jesus. Some Jewish nationalists believed submission to Rome was a betrayal of God and Israel. Taxes were not merely an economic burden. They were evidence that a foreign empire controlled the land. Roman soldiers were not simply government officials. They were the visible presence of occupation. For some resistance movements, faithfulness required liberation. They expected God to restore Israel's independence, defeat its enemies, and establish a righteous kingdom. In the decades following the ministry of Jesus, some of this resistance hardened into revolutionary movements, commonly associated with the Zealots. An even more radical group became known as the Sicari. Their name came from the small daggers they concealed beneath their clothing. They attacked Romans and Jewish collaborators, sometimes in crowded public places where they could disappear before being identified. They believed the existing order could not be reformed. It had to be removed. Many people hoped for a military messiah, a warrior king, a leader who would overthrow Roman authority and restore national power. That expectation makes the teachings of Jesus about enemies, forgiveness, and non-retaliation even more shocking. One of his disciples was known as Simon the Zealot. Another was Matthew the tax collector. Think about the tension inside that group. One man was identified with zeal against foreign domination. The other had worked inside the Roman taxation system. Under normal circumstances, they might have viewed each other as enemies. Jesus placed them at the same table. He did not deny the reality of oppression, but he refused to build his kingdom by reproducing the hatred of the existing world. When one of his followers used a sword during his arrest, Jesus told him to put it away. His kingdom would not be established through the same violence used by earthly empires. Now step back and look at the entire map again. The Sadducees protected the temple establishment. The Pharisees shaped religious practice in daily life. The priests and Levites performed sacred service. The scribes interpreted the law. The Herodians supported the political order. Tax collectors worked inside the Roman economic system. Samaritans lived beyond the boundaries of accepted Judean identity. The Essenes pursued purity through separation. The revolutionaries pursued freedom through resistance. Each group offered a different answer to the same crisis. How should the people of Israel remain faithful to God in a divided world under foreign occupation? Protect the institution. Perfect religious behavior. Interpret the law. Cooperate with power. Profit from the system. Separate from corruption. Resist the empire. Or survive outside the accepted boundaries. Then Jesus entered this world and refused to fit neatly into any single category. He taught in synagogues but challenged religious performance. He respected the sacredness of the temple but confronted its corruption. He spoke about a kingdom but refused armed revolution. He welcomed tax collectors without approving exploitation. He spoke with Samaritans without accepting inherited hatred. He called religious leaders to repentance and social outsiders to transformation. Jesus did not simply reverse the pyramid and place a different elite at the top. He challenged the obsession with being at the top. In his kingdom, the greatest becomes a servant. The first becomes last. The proud are brought low. The excluded are invited to the table. Power is not measured by how many people obey you. It is measured by how willingly you serve. The religious leaders believed authority came from office. The scholars believed it came from knowledge. The political supporters believed it came from access. The revolutionaries believed it came from force. Jesus placed a servant at the center. He placed a child among his disciples. He washed feet. He touched lepers. He ate with rejected people. And he told his followers that whoever wanted to become great must become the servant of all. The names have changed. The clothing has changed. The empire has changed. But the human struggle for status, control, purity, belonging, and power remains. Sometimes the Sadducee instinct appears in institutions that protect themselves at any cost. Sometimes the Pharisee instinct appears in people who turn morality into public performance. Sometimes the scribe appears in the expert who wins every argument but offers no mercy. Sometimes the Herodian appears in those who use faith to remain close to political influence. Sometimes the tax collector appears in anyone who profits from an unjust system. Sometimes the Essene appears in communities that retreat into isolation. And sometimes the zealot appears in people who believe violence will create righteousness. These groups are not merely figures trapped in an ancient world. Their instincts remain alive. Inside institutions, inside communities, inside political movements, and sometimes inside us. Jesus did not come merely to help one group defeat another. He came announcing a kingdom that exposed the pride, fear, greed, and violence beneath every human system. A kingdom where mercy is greater than reputation, where service is greater than status, where compassion is greater than ritual performance, and where the wounded person beside the road matters more than the position we hold inside the pyramid. The names have changed, but the pyramid has not.